And Eli, thanks for joining us from the Windy City. We're grateful for your participation tonight, and really grateful also too for this book that you've written. So I want to begin by talking obviously about the sobering state of things here in America. This is obviously kind of an unprecedented moment, the worst pandemic in a century, the worst recession, I think, in our lifetimes, and really the worst governmental paralysis that we've seen in decades, from obviously the CDC to the FDA and the White House. So, you know, a lot's happening, and obviously in some ways, a lot that's happening is devastating. We're seeing tens of thousands of Americans dying, especially our grandparents. We're seeing millions of parents losing their jobs. And you know, many of us have been struggling with some kind of cabin fever that can make family life difficult, obviously, at times for people who are stuck with you know, a spouse and kids and the like. So I don't want to in any way kind of minimize what's happening. We can imagine, for instance, that given research on the links between, for instance, unemployment and divorce. This is one Harvard study up on your screen right now, sort of kind of giving us the connection there between unemployment and divorce, that one impact, at least for some couples, of all this, you know, may be more marital conflict and more marital instability for, you know, for some portion of the married population in America. I can also, I think, guess that the marriage rate, which obviously just reached a new low in 2018, we've just heard about that this week, from the CDC, is probably going to head even lower. And this sort of decline in marriage is going to be more consequential for the least of these, for working class and for poor Americans who have been, you know, most affected by this pandemic, and will be more affected by the economic fallout of this pandemic as well. And so I think kind of the bad news here, in part, as we kind of emerge from this pandemic, I think, is that a larger minority of Americans will never marry. And I'm guessing, you know, between 30 and 35% of today's young adults will never marry, which will be kind of a new milestone in American family life. And that's, I think, unfortunate, because, you know, marriage obviously gives meaning, purpose, happiness, and solidarity to most of the men and women who marry in America. So that's, again, that's, I think, kind of the clear bad news for marriage kind of coming out of this this pandemic. So what's the silver lining here? You know, you might be asking yourself. And I think the silver lining here, in part, is that the soulmate myth of marriage, I think, really took hold to an extent in the 1970s, will largely die out. Will largely lose a lot of the power that it has gained in America since the 70s, you know, since the me decade that emerged in the 70s. And when I'm talking about the soulmate myth is the idea that marriage is primarily about an intense emotional connection between two people that should last only so long as that connection remains happy, fulfilling, and life-giving to the self. This is, you know, the story of 1,000 songs, 100 rom-coms, and a dozen self-help books. And in kind of thinking about this this model, this soulmate idea, I think it's predicated in part on the notion that in the 21st century, we have climbed what Eli Finkel has called Mount Maslow. Now, let me be clear here. Eli is not a proponent of the soulmate myth, but inspired by the work of the great 20th century psychologist Abraham Maslow, Eli argues that our wealth and our public policies, in a sense, have freed us up, or many of us up, to focus on higher order needs in our unions, rather than on basic family, material, and safety needs. This kind of thinking is certainly consistent with the assumptions undergirding the soulmate model. That's because the soulmate model sees marriage as primarily about those goods at the top of Mount Maslow: emotional connection, self-expression, and personal fulfillment. This is a more adult-centered model of marriage, a me-centered model of marriage, And this is a model that discounts the classical functions of marriage: kids and kin, putting bread on the table, and a roof over one's head. Okay, so again, the idea here is that the soulmate model kind of, I think, made more sense in late 20th century America and in 21st century America, because a lot of people could assume that their material needs were basically met, and that they didn't need to attend as much to the welfare of perhaps their kids and their kin. So that's sort of the sociological idea here. But I think in a world marked by dramatic economic insecurity, rising unemployment, the threat of reoccurring disease, as well as increases in home production. My wife and I have just started a garden out here with our kids. I think the meaning and the practice of marriage will be changing in ways that make this soulmate model less compelling and less realistic as well. So the silver lining here is that in the face of so much trauma and economic dislocation, most marriages will not collapse, and many will instead emerge stronger and more stable as husbands and wives develop a new appreciation for how much they love and depend on their spouse, and how much they, their kids, and their kin depend upon them keeping their marriage together. Right. I would predict that marital commitment will increase. And I do so in part because research done by colleagues of mine and myself in the wake of the last Great Recession found that the hardship associated with that recession, quote, led many Americans to deepen their commitments to marriage, and in some cases to table or cancel their plans to divorce or separate. In fact, we have seen divorce fall by about 20% since the last Great Recession. And I would suspect that the divorce rate will fall even more dramatic fashion in the wake of this recession, this COVID-related recession. We've also actually seen, too, when it comes to kids, the share of kids being born outside of marriage fall modestly since the last Great Recession. And I would anticipate the same kind of dynamic playing out in the wake of this recession, as Americans, including adults, become more cautious about entering into to family life. And for all these reasons, I think we're going to see kind of family stability, as this figure here suggests, tick upwards a bit more for kids in America, with less divorce and less non-marital childbearing, equaling more family stability in America. And finally, I think we are also going to see, as we kind of move through this pandemic and out of this pandemic, that married Americans are going to be emerging in better financial and emotional shape. We haven't yet seen any real clear financial data on this question. We will, I think, in the next couple of months. We've already seen from some work that I've done with Peyton Roth at AI that Americans who are married are less likely, for instance, to report that they're lonely. And new Canadian data suggests that marrieds in Canada are less likely to report that they're sad. So there's some kind of recognition and appreciation, either explicit or implicit on the part of many folks, that marriage is kind of a protective institution, particularly again in times like these. So you put all this together, and what I'm suggesting here is that for those who are married, and of course it is a more selective group today, there'll be a kind of a more family first orientation and approach to marriage, where people will be seeing marriage as partly as about a romantic and emotional connection between spouses, but also about children, about commitment, about cash, and about community. Many of sort of the classic goods that marriage has classically offered to adults, to their kids, and to their communities. In other words, more and more married men and women in the US will be embracing what has been called familism in the social sciences, namely the values and virtues that sustain strong and stable marriages, anchored, I think, in a growing willingness to put the welfare of the family above that of the individual or of the self. So again, and to conclude here, the silver lining, I think, coming out of this, at least for marriage, is that marriage will emerge stronger, more stable, and more likely to be a secure harbor for our children. So that's my take on marriage in post-COVID America. So with that, let me turn over the virtual stage here to Eli to give us his perspective on my comments and his perspective on kind of where he thinks marriage is headed, both in this pandemic and coming out of this pandemic. So with that, I'm going to let Eli jump in here.
Sorry about that. I find your perspective exciting and promising and plausible. You know, if I'm hearing correctly, you're suggesting that to the extent that the COVID virus and the quarantine and the economic shocks place people into more economically vulnerable position, maybe more vulnerable on their intimate families rather than under circumstances where they're not in quarantine and the cash is flowing better and so forth, then I find it plausible that people will stop seeking some of what you've called the soulmate marriage quite as strongly. And even sort of my variation of those ideas in terms of looking at the top of Maslow's hierarchy there for self-expression and personal growth and authenticity and self-actualization, those sorts of things that I think people are looking to more today than in the past, they may well jettison some of those expectations in at least the short run, and we'll see if it creates sort of a new culture around, you know, familism or whatever. What's interesting is, so I find all of that both interesting and plausible. It focuses on central tendencies. So you're focusing on the mean here. And I think if I had to speculate, and you know, we're speculating is not necessarily the wisest thing for social scientists, but here we go. If I had to speculate, I think I share your intuition about this, that to the degree that we end up in a pretty serious financial recession, depression, something like that coming out of this, at least for the foreseeable future, then yes, I think people will indeed let go of some of those higher level aspirations and settle more for things on the order of stability. Yes, they'll still care about intimacy and love, but toward the top of the hierarchy, they'll care less. And yes, to the degree that we find ourselves in a world where resources are scarce and the ability to have this sort of connection is difficult, then it's a great thing that people are letting go of some of those expectations. My own perspective is that the mean tells us a lot of meaningful and important information, but that we have to distinguish the average marriage from sort of variation around that mean. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is what happens when the expectations for how marriage should work start to go from the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, the you know, safety and security stuff, up to the middle where you're looking at love and belonging, and all the way to the top where you're looking at self-expression or self-actualization. What it does is it makes marriage more fragile, and that people who are looking for that sort of what you've called soulmate marriage, that they'll be disappointed with a marriage that would have been fully satisfying for their grandparents. But at the same time, they may well achieve a level of marital connection that would have been out of reach in an era where people weren't even trying to meet those sorts of needs. And so from my perspective, if we find ourselves in a situation where there's a recession and people are hunkering down and they're going down Maslow's hierarchy, down Maslow's mountain a little bit, that yes, it is indeed a good idea that they should let go of some of those self-expressive or soulmate style expectations, but that doing so is costly, especially for those who either through being highly compatible or through having really a lot of time and emotional energy to invest in the relationship, could have succeeded up there at the top.
Actually, your comments, Eli, are I think, particularly interesting in terms of thinking more about, you know, the thesis in your book here. And so, you know, given what you've just said, could you kind of tell us a bit more about how you would define the all or nothing marriage, and right, to tell us kind of what the evidence is from your perspective that marriages for that group you were just talking about are qualitatively better than those for Americans, you know, at an earlier point in history?
Yeah, so the idea of the all or nothing marriage is that as our expectations have shifted, like I said, from the bottom to the top, the average marriage is getting worse. That is, we're disappointed in a marriage that would have been totally adequate in earlier eras. But those of us who are able to connect up there at the top of Maslow's hierarchy achieve this particularly profound level of fulfillment. In terms of evidence, some of it's based on theory and some of it's based on evidence. I'll talk briefly about both, but let me just acknowledge from the outset that the ideal study for this, as you know, doesn't exist. Probably the best longitudinal data we have are from the National Social Survey, which goes back only to the 70s. And really, when it assesses marital quality, gives you three choices. Is your marriage, was it very satisfying, somewhat,
Very
or
pretty.
not at all?
Right.
That's not the level of gradation you're going to need if you want to find, deep, profound connection with your partner. So at the level of theory, Abraham Maslow, whose work I generally find compelling, at least in the regard I'm about to voice, he suggests that it's really those higher need gratifications that yield the phrase or the quote is something to the effect of profound happiness, serenity, and richness of the inner life. Now, he was no dummy. Everybody knows that Maslow understood that if you're starving, like it's difficult to have a meaningful life, and eating enough food and not freezing is enormously important. But when you want to focus on what makes life great, not what makes it adequate, what makes it sufficient, but what makes it truly special, it's really as you go up the hierarchy of his needs that leads you to this profound sense of fulfillment and richness of the inner life. So yes, love and belongingness matter, esteem matters, and self-actualization, or the sense of authenticity and personal growth, also matter. So at the level of theory, the argument goes that as we look higher up that hierarchy, the extent to which you have achieved success in your marriage should be an especially strong predictor of your overall quality of life. And that effect is there. So now I'm switching to empirical evidence. So there is meta-analytic evidence, so studies that analyze all the published data that exist, that looks at the association of marital quality with your overall happiness with your life. So it turns out that every study that's ever been done, this goes back at least to the 70s, shows a positive correlation. You know as well as anybody that one of the things that really makes life good is having a successful rather than a frustrating and disappointing marriage. And that has always been true. What's really interesting from my perspective is that effect is about twice as strong in the 21st century as it was around 1980. That means that the extent to which your marriage is good rather than bad is almost twice as strong a predictor of your overall quality of life today than in the past. And then the final bit of evidence, I don't even find all that convincing, but at least is supportive generally of the thesis, is there are one-off sorts of studies that attempted to say, we have identified the people who have truly spectacular marriages, and you could find one from 1965 that says there was 20%, and then you can find one from 2012 that says it's 40%. The measures are different. I'm not banking on those, but collectively and through sort of triangulation, I found the theoretical and the empirical perspectives compelling in that regard.
I guess one thing I'd like to ask you, Eli, though, in terms of thinking about sort of marital quality, even before the pandemic, that is sort of as you were kind of wrapping up your book, I mean, it seems to me we know that there's research that I've done, that others have done, kind of on the way in which generosity is not just in marriage, but in a variety of different domains of social life, is linked to better outcomes and more happiness. And so I guess one of my concerns with the way you sort of framed the argument in the book is to sort of focus on the self, and sort of the self's purposes, the self's objectives. And I think that if you're encouraged instead to kind of put the welfare of your spouse and your kids and even your kin above that of yourself, and of course I think all of us struggle to do that in reality, but if you're kind of at least aspiring to do that and encouraged to do that, you're actually, that's sort of a different way, if you will, by growing in the virtues of for instance of charity and loyalty and fidelity and compromise, in service of the good of others. That's a sort of another way to kind of realize this kind of happiness. How would that sort of fit into your thinking into Maslow's mountain?
I completely agree with that. And it's interesting because one of the ideas that really troubled me as I was trying to make sense of all of the various perspectives when I was writing the book is it is hard to reconcile self me, my priorities, my aspirations, with this sense of commitment and responsibility that are virtually required to have a meaningful long-term family life. I mean, it's very, very few of us that are just not going to run into any difficulties. Almost all of us will. And so if your view is, I'm going to be in this relationship as long as it is pleasurable for me, as long as it sort of feels good, and when it stops feeling good, I'm going to stop, then it's hard to imagine that being an effective approach to marriage. And so, you know, that one of the chapters in the book, I try to make a distinction. And again, I don't know how persuasive it is to everybody. It was useful to me in trying to make sense of all the perspectives between like a happiness focus and a meaning focus. And in fairness to someone like Maslow, who I think gets unfairly treated as sort of me generation or narcissist, he was, I mean, if you look at the people that he identified as who are the people who have self-actualized lives, I mean, he is talking about people who are deeply devoted to a purpose and a cause higher than themselves. And so from my vantage point, being interested in self-expression and personal growth is not the same thing as being interested in pleasure and happiness, at least happiness defined in some sort of short-term sense. And so for many of us, and here I think we may agree, for an increasing number of us, we're defining a meaningful, purposeful life, once again, in terms of happy, stable family. And nobody's ever parented like this generation is parenting.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a fair point. I guess that leads to my next question. I mean, how do you think, though, about kind of talking about these issues, particularly as it relates to kind of kids and marriage and families, in a more, in a more public way? I mean, like, what is sort of your broader message to the public about how important marriage is when it comes to raising kids? How integral is it? What kind of message do you want to convey as a scholar and as a public citizen related to sort of marriage and children?
Well, it appears to be a good option if you were going to consider the ways that you might raise children. I think it is fair to say that there is a correlation between childhood spent within a two-family house with adequate resources. Two-parent house with adequate resources and success in life, including your own future marriage. So just at the level of correlation, I think that the argument has a lot going for it, that marriage is one good way to raise children. I certainly wouldn't go so far as to say it's the only way. So far as I can tell, the research on, for example, same-sex relationships, committed same-sex relationships, shows children who are every bit as well adjusted. And of course, they weren't legally allowed to be married in much of the land until just a few years ago. So I think there are many ways that you can provide a stable life for children. I do think marriage is a pretty well-tested one, and I think it is a good bet. I think any other context that also provides a sense of love and a sense that the world is a stable and safe place could also work.
So yeah, it sounds like then, in terms of the public takeaway from your vantage point, there really isn't kind of a kind of clear message that marriage is. Well, I mean, would you agree it's the ideal way?
No.
Yeah.
No. I do think, I mean, and this is one of the reasons I was so excited about the idea of coming on and chatting with you, is I do think that you and I come to similar topics, and so far as I can tell, do it from many similar assumptions. But I think I find myself more reluctant, and you should chime in if you disagree, more reluctant to say, we've figured it out, and these are the things that families should do, or that individuals should do. And you know that I have some sort of radical beliefs, even though I'm quite traditional in some sense and seeing real value in marriage and those sorts of things. I'm sort of toward the left fringe on some other things in terms of being open to consensual non-monogamy as one way that people might try to cultivate a more meaningful relationship while also trying to, lead more individual lives. And I don't think those are necessarily incompatible. So no, I don't feel like I know for everybody. what is the best way for them to build a successful life, a successful family life, for example, we have a pretty good sense what the ingredients are. They're the things that I mentioned, and I think that you mentioned. They're a loving household, a sense of stability, a sense that there's safety in the world, that things aren't precarious. And how people deliver that to their children, sort of not my business.
Right. Well, I guess we definitely disagree on that particular on
Yeah.
that issue. I guess let me just maybe push you there a little bit more. I think my question is, I mean, in fact, I think you're a wonderful example here of a larger pattern that we see actually in the data. We just did a study in California, and we found that college-educated Californians are more likely than their fellow Californians to embrace this idea of family diversity, that there are, you know, a wide range of different family types that can work for kids. And they're also more kind of accepting of women having kids on their own as single mothers, for instance. So the sort of public ethic is one of kind of toleration, one of acceptance, and sort of, I think, echoes the kinds of things that you were just saying, you know, a few minutes ago, Eli. But then when it actually comes to sort of their own plans for family life and their own practice of family life, college-educated Californians are more likely to say it's personally important to them to have their kids in marriage, and they are much more likely to be stably married with children than other Californians. And so I think, you know, from my perspective here, you know, the tension or even the tragedy is that upper middle class Americans, you know, like you and me, are managing to forge stable, by and large, two-parent married families for themselves and their kids, and they benefit financially. They benefit generally emotionally. Their kids do better on a whole host of outcomes. They're more likely to graduate from college, less likely to end up in trouble with the police, you know, all these kinds of outcomes one could talk about. And yet when it comes to kind of taking a stand in the public square for this very thing that's benefiting them and their 401ks and their kids long-term prospects, it's just, you know, whatever floats your boat, you know, whatever kind of strategy you think is best. And so there's a way in which this way of life that is benefiting, you know, the upper third or upper 25% of the country in large part, there's no kind of cultural support for that. So that's sort of the tension that I see as you talk about these issues, Eli.
May I just ask? I just want to understand your hypothesis or your theory here. So I think what you're suggesting is that you're not using unpleasant words or anything, but that many of us are hypocrites. That the educated elite the educated liberals, basically the liberal elite, are hypocrites. And I know you didn't use a bad word, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth. And that if we spoke the way we lived, then more people would follow that lead, and that more of them would be able to live this sort of life cycle ordering that's associated with economic success and education and all that stuff. Is that the thesis?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the idea, right, is that, you know, educated liberals are not hesitant to talk, as you in your book talk about the importance of, you know, equality and diversity and minority rights of one sort or another. But on this particular issue, there is a great reluctance to articulate the idea in public that, and I'm not saying that only one way of family works. I'm just sort of saying that, you know, on average, and I was raised by a single mom, but on average, you know, our society, our communities will be better off if more Americans.
I did say that on average. I think I said something to the effect of, this is a pretty well-established option that again, the correlations seem to be there. But I will say, I can push back even more than that. So there is the obvious confound here of money. Now, again, unraveling that entirely is almost impossible, because I think what you would probably argue, and I think there's a good case to be made here, is that if we had this other family life throughout this more traditional style of family life with more of the population, then money might be better distributed across the population in general. There might not be so much inequality. I can tell you, I don't think it would be easy to live the sort of marriage that I am trying to live if I lived like the average American. That is if I had the level of resources as the, I don't know, 50th percentile, a working class person. So, there's a lot of variation in here, but perhaps it's two jobs to put things together at this point. Paying the babysitter to go out to, dinner and a show and then talk about it afterwards and make sweet love late into the night. Like these are options that are available to people like us that are a whole lot more difficult to achieve among people with fewer resources. And that even ignores the fact that probably the things that people with fewer resources have to talk about are less pleasant, right? Like, how are we ever going to pay for Timmy's bicycle repair because there's no way, where's that money going to come from, right? Those are unpleasant things to talk about, and we have fewer resources to bring to the conversation when we get a chance. And so it is highly plausible to me that at least a healthy proportion of why people without a college degree, and especially without a high school degree, are struggling so much has less to do with the fact that people aren't standing on soapbox. Again, I don't want to be dismissive, that people like you and me, well, I guess you are, but people like me aren't saying, hey, everybody, like, be more committed and cherish your spouse more, whatever version of it you would prefer. I think that if I had to pick like where I think like the majority of the variance is going to go to in terms of making their lives better, it would probably be giving them enough resources to find other ways to connect.
So we actually agree on the importance, I think, of addressing a lot of the economic challenges facing American families. And I think that's, going to be obviously even more important in the wake of this pandemic.
Mm.
But I'm just sort of, what I would also, of course, add is there's a cultural piece to all this.
I agree with that.
And one of the things we saw in this recent California report is that Asian Americans are markedly more likely to embrace what I call kind of familistic, values and virtues. And that even when you control for their education and for their income, they have much more stable families than do other Californians. And so it just kind of is one indication of the way in which this sort of challenge, I think, this marriage divide, family divide that's opened up in this country is not simply about economics. It's also about kind of different cultural orientations and about the ways in which it's become more difficult for us, for a variety of reasons, to kind of publicly embrace marriage, and to embrace not just marriage as an institution, but the virtues and the values that actually are more likely to put people on the path of a stable family life, and their kids on that path as well. So all I'm saying is that I think, at least from my perspective, if we're serious about bridging this marriage divide, I think we have to address a lot of the economic issues that you and I would agree about. But we also think have to address the ways in which our public schools, our universities, oftentimes our media outlets, and our pop culture, I think, actually don't tell a truthful story about family life and about marriage and about the importance of things like, sacrifice, fidelity, compromise, prudence, and how these all relate to having kids and raising kids and keeping a marriage going, even when you don't have enough money to go out for a nice show and the like.
No, that's right. That's right. And any strictly economic story has to explain why there are millions of miserable rich people and millions of very happy poor people, right? So it's clearly not a sufficient variable to explain it. And yet another strong place of agreement is I completely agree with you about the importance of culture and economics and the interaction of the two. In fact, what was the 60s and the 70s other than a massive social, I don't want to say cataclysm, how about upheaval? And it wasn't a time of poverty, right? It was, all tides were rising. There was relatively low levels of inequality, and yet the divorce rate was absolutely skyrocketing through that. And I completely agree. And furthermore, this idea of the marriage expectations ascending up Maslow's hierarchy, also culture, right? Those are about expectations. It's not economics, that's culture. So for me, the story is about the intersection, and I think for you also, is about the intersection of culture and economics. I think if I had to try to pinpoint, and I find it very satisfying to try, if I had to pinpoint where the difference is, what I would like to see is not that everybody maybe come down Maslow's hierarchy and sort of settle in somewhere, which I agree with you will be better for the average, but probably worse for some. What I would love is to make all of us better. This is from the perspective of a relationships psychologist, right? This is really close to home now. A lot of this other stuff is on your turf as a sociologist, and some of the demography is closer to you than to me, but now we're in basically relationship psychology. are people educable to figure out these are the specific ways that our marriage is really effective, that our relationship functions well? And are we good at figuring out how to double down on those things? At the same time, are we effective at being like, you know where we suck? We are terrible at the following things. And those are the places where you descend not only to sort of the midpoint of Maslow's hierarchy, you just sort of forget as much as you can and try to alter your expectations. And look, maybe we disagree on how plausible it is that people can do that. But if we stipulate for the moment that people are educable to learn to be better about leaning in on the things where they're great in their marriage and leaning back in the places where they're not, then I think you can find this blend of not just high expectations or low expectations or family orientation versus money orientation versus soulmate orientation, but specifically, what are the ways that we're good? What are the ways that we're bad? And then you can leverage the best while mitigating the disappointment of the worst. And the reason I favor that approach, that more nuanced and subtle approach, the one that doesn't fit well on a note card, over the one that says everybody should sort of stop expecting this self-expressive stuff, stop expecting the soulmate stuff, is for some people, and I don't just mean 5, right? For a healthy minority of people, those sorts of expectations can produce something profoundly fulfilling. Yes, also for their children.
Right. Of course, my concern is obviously different in terms of wondering how accessible is your model to less educated Americans who not only, may have more economic challenges they're facing, but just may not have the same kind of, language and cultural toolkit to do the kind of marital work that I think your model suggests. But let me just turn to some of the questions that are now, we've got a bunch of questions up here on the chat. And certainly one question that's come up in a couple of venues here is sort of how do we think about domestic violence in general and amidst the this pandemic? And I've certainly seen obviously news, or I've seen articles that suggest that domestic violence is on the upswing amidst this lockdown. And that would certainly be one of the more, probably the most concerning kind of family dynamics, although I'd like to see actually better evidence about what's actually happening. But if in fact it is the case that we're seeing an uptick for obviously a minority of couples, then that's certainly one of the black clouds, if you will, kind of affecting families. And I certainly would not, just so people know, although I think it's generally better for kids to be raised by their own married parents, it's also clear from work done by my colleague here at UVA, Bob Emery and others, that kids who are in high conflict marriages marked by domestic violence, for instance, are more likely to better if their parents part ways. So I'm not saying kind of family stability in all times and all places. But anyways, do you have any thoughts on this question about, or have you seen any data on domestic violence amidst the pandemic?
No, but I definitely share the concern, and just 2 little comments here maybe. One is just today, a whole bunch of us, so 43 social and behavioral scientists from around the globe and across various disciplines, largely representing psychology, but certainly beyond then, published a piece in a journal called Nature Human Behavior. And I had my little section on what I think might happen with COVID and the quarantine for relationships. And yes, in that little section, I didn't have much space. I mentioned this concern as well, that if you have a situation where people are much more interdependent up in each other's business than usual, and where means of escape and freedom are curtailed, it's a recipe for at-risk couples in particular to go the wrong way rather than the right way. And I'm highly concerned about it. And the other little comment I had is, this is where I agree with you very, very strongly. Your point right at the top was, I think in part, this is a time where we might be able to reboot a little bit and focus on tamping down some of the more, what I think you would say are extreme expectations in marriage. And I have to say that I do think one of the things that is going to be contributing to dissatisfaction in general and at the extreme domestic violence is this sense of disappointment and frustration, and those things are tied to our expectations, right? And so we have some control over that, but very far from infinite control, and it is a source of major concern.
Yeah, well, no, we definitely agree. I think that kind of not having sky high expectations for what your spouse can deliver and what your marriage can deliver makes for not only kind of a more realistic view, but, you know, obviously paradoxically often a happier marriage too as well.
Yeah.
Other questions here. Well, let me ask you this in terms of just, I mean, I think this also relates to kind of the pandemic moment or this lockdown. I mean, I was actually analyzing the GSS recently and found that in the GSS, you know, having regular contact with friends was a pretty good predictor of marital quality. I mean, how do you see kind of friendships and community life being woven into a successful marriage, kind of from your perspective, Eli?
In general, you mean?
Yeah, in general, yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah, I mean, my read of the evidence is consistent with yours. Again, not speaking for everybody, but comfortable saying that on average, sustaining an intimate social connection, an intimate social network of at least 2 or 3 real intimate friends or family members that you talk to regularly about important things beyond the marriage is generally associated with well-being. And I think one of the major reasons why is because we are increasingly looking to this one relationship, marriage, for so many of the higher level Maslow needs in terms of emotional and psychological fulfillment. And that's fine. Many people are able to do that, but it's also high risk for a lot of reasons, not least of which is how likely is it that your spouse is going to be skilled in all of those particular types of things. So if you are able to, you know, distribute your needs, and again, you're also meeting other people's needs across an array of people rather than just one, the odds of you being more successful are higher. Also, it's a lot to put on one relationship. I mean, even if your spouse really is good at this, it's like, man, that is a lot to ask of me, a lot of me to ask of you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more on that particular question. So I guess let me just sort of wrap it up by asking you, is there anything else that you would kind of say in terms of thinking about anything else that you would add in terms of your own reflections on how this pandemic and the economic fallout is likely to change the way in which Americans, you know, think about marriage and do marriage? And I guess too, you know, I have seen both in survey evidence that I've looked at and elsewhere that, and some news reports as well, that at least some singles out there are maybe a little bit more appreciative of the way in which marriage might give them a certain degree, not just of financial security, but even kind of, you know, emotional and social support that they're not able to access right now. So maybe some folks in the wake of this will actually look at marriage with fresh eyes, I guess is one thought that I have. What else would you sort of say about the impact of this pandemic on both marriage as an institution, but also kind of its appeal to younger adults as well?
Well, perhaps staying on brand with my lower willingness to make bold claims. I think there are competing predictions here, and I don't know which one is going to win. So I think you articulated a very compelling version of one of the predictions, which is that this gives us, that this pandemic slash quarantine slash economic, who knows, maybe calamity situation, that this gives us an opportunity to refocus in ways that make us a little bit more sensitive to just how much we're asking of our marriages, and that increased sensitivity on average will be a good thing. I think that is a very compelling argument. I also find sort of an argument that I made earlier, and I think that you agreed with, also compelling, which is it's hard to do marriage on the cheap. Now here I do mean emotional resources, but I also mean economic resources, and in large part I mean economic resources because they contribute to emotional resources. So I don't know where we're going to land and who's going to land in which bucket in terms of, you know, is it going to jolt us in ways that sort of sensitize us to ways that we're asking too much? That's likely to be beneficial on average. Is it likely to stress us out? And I mean, literally just make us feel deeply anxious and poor enough that it's actually hard to sustain an intimate connection because we're panicked and now life is just unbelievably stressful. Which of those is going to be stronger? I don't have a strong instinct for that.
Right. Well, Eli, thank you so much for joining us at Family Studies for, I think, our fourth webinar. It's been a great conversation. I'm grateful to you for taking some time out of your schedule. And I would definitely encourage our listeners to take a look at your book, The All or Nothing Marriage. Again, I'm grateful and wish you the best. And please stay safe and healthy, and your family as well.
It was a pleasure and an honor, and thanks so much to your team.
Okay. Thanks, Eli.